Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last off-season garden hour. Tonight with us, we have Hans Klopp and Laura Edwards. Hans is going to start us off with talking about soils. And Hans is the SDSU Extension State Climatologist. And then
No.
Laura, sorry, that's Laura. Extension State Climatologist. And Hans is the Soil Health Field Specialist for SDSU Extension. So Hans, if you would like to kick us off.
So tonight I'm going to talk about how to soil sample in your garden and also briefly talk about fertilizing and whether you need to add fertilizer. So the required plant nutrients are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, iron, manganese, copper, boron, zinc, molybdenum, cobalt, and chlorine. Plants can get carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from water and the atmosphere, where these other nutrients need to come from the soil or water that's added to the soil. And the macronutrients that plants need is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. And you probably, if you soil test your garden, the one that you'll probably need the most of is nitrogen, because nitrogen is easily lost from the soil because it can move downward from leaching, and it can be lost through denitrification to anaerobic conditions. And when you harvest your fruits, a lot of the nitrogen goes into the fruiting part of the vegetable. And a lot of these other a lot of these other macronutrients stay near the soil surface. Most fertilizers have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in them, which we'll talk about later. And sometimes soils will need sulfur. And sulfur is also pretty mobile like nitrogen, but the other four macronutrients are not very mobile. And soils in South Dakota are high in calcium and magnesium, which you can see by the soil tests they have later on. And micronutrients include iron, manganese, copper, boron, zinc, molybdenum, cobalt, and chlorine. I really would not worry about any of these in your soil test unless you are seeing deficiencies of them. So here's the form of the elements that plants can uptake. I'm not going to go through and list this. You can just look through it, and I if you want to come back and watch it, you can look at it. And some of the forms of nutrients you apply, they're not exactly in this form. A lot of them are in the organic form, but through decomposition of the organic materials, they're converted into the plant available forms of these nutrients. And soil pH affects what form the nutrients are in. So if your pH is off, you'll have reduced availability of these nutrients because these elements will be in slightly different forms. So here's an example of a pattern to sample for a 1,000 square foot garden, which a lot of the garden nutrient garden fertility recommendations are given for per 1,000 square feet, whereas in agronomy, it's in pounds per acre that you need to add. And you want to sample across your garden and try to place a sample from each. Try to get a random sample that covers your entire garden, unless you were going to grow some crops that were legumes that would fix nitrogen and some that were not, where I'd sample them separately. Although looking at most garden soil samples, you probably don't need to add any much for phosphorus or potassium. So here's an example of my community garden I have, and on the orange corners there is, or on the corners here where the triangles are, is the edge of it, and then the pink flags are where I pulled samples using a soil probe. And what you need is a shovel or soil probe to collect the sample, a container to mix the sample in, a plastic or paper bag to put sample in to send it off to the lab, a knife to cut the sample to a certain depth, because usually when you sample your garden, you sampling is usually done in the 0 to 6 inch depth range, and the recommendations for fertility is given based on how much of the nutrients are available in that depth range. And besides nitrogen and sulfur, plants get most of the other nutrients from near the soil surface, and they need more, plants need more potassium and phosphorus up front, and then they need more nitrogen when they're fruiting. So here's an example of a collected sample I have with the soil probe. I used a ruler to measure down 6 inches. And then I placed the sample into the container, and I took a sample that I cut to 6 inches from all those flags that I had shown in the plot in the previous slide. And here's an example of how you could do it with a shovel. I would take a knife and cut it to 0 to 6, and then try to cut it so you have a rectangle about 3 inches across to by 0 to 6 inch depth. And then I with the probe samples, I put the 9 probes from the 0 to 6 inch depth into those containers. Then I mix the soil together in the container to homogenize it. You could do the same thing with a shovel. Take sample from 6 locations and trim it so you have the same volume from each location going into the plot. Going not in the plot, going into the container or 5 gallon bucket, and then I would mix it together with your hands, and then I would place a subsample of it into a plastic bag. And you probably need about 2 cups of 1 or 2 cups of samples, enough to do the fertility analysis. Probably 2 cups is adequate. And here's an example of some soil test data I got where I enlarged it. And these first two nerve samples are from the Northeast Research Farm by South Shore, which is north of Watertown. And that soil's has about 30% clay, so it has quite a bit of clay. And you see that the levels of the nutrients are fairly high. If you compare these to the nutrient recommendations chart, the levels of all the nutrients beside nitrogen are adequate if you go through it. And if you compare it to the sand soil you have, you can see that the sand soil has way lower level of all these nutrients compared to the clay, the silty clay loam slash clay loam soil that is at Northeast Research Farm. And it's because when the soil has more clay, it has higher cation exchange capacity, which is basically a sum of the amount of base cations that are absorbed to the clay and organic matter particles. And if you have higher organic matter and higher clay content, you have greater cation exchange capacity, which is an indication that you have better nutrient retention in the soil. So if you have a sandy soil, really all you can do to increase it is add organic matter. And here's the soil test I got from the community garden that I had. And this soil needed some potassium and phosphorus, which a lot of garden soil samples I've heard in South Dakota don't really need potassium and phosphorus, because when you add compost or manure to your garden, they're high in phosphorus, especially, and your plant removes more of the nitrogen than phosphorus when you harvest your fruits. So you'll end up with high phosphorus levels in some gardens, which actually can be bad for some soil biology because your arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which create associations with plant roots, are less active when there's no need for plant roots to associate with the fungi to help taking up nutrients. And here's the soil test recommendations where you would see a response. If you compare them to the previous slides, in my community garden, the level of everything besides phosphorus and potassium are above where you see a response. So essentially, when you have very low levels, you're very likely to see an improvement in your yield when you add a fertilizer. Whereas if you have high high levels of nutrients here, you would not likely see a response, and you would not need to add any fertilizer. So here's how to interpret for garden recommendations from the fertility recommendation guide for South Dakota. They just have an equation which will give you how many pounds per thou- 1,000 square feet you need to add based on what your soil test level is. So if you put this into the equation and if your soil test phosphorus, for example, is a high enough parts per million that it is negative, you don't need to add any phosphorus. Same thing for potassium or nitrogen. And this gives, for the soil test nitrogen, it wants it in pounds per acre available versus parts per million, which a good estimate is just multiplying the part for the 0 to 6 is to multiply the parts per million times 2. Or you can go through the whole bulk density calculation to get it, which you can ask me if you need to do that. So like this sand soil has this much phosphorus, this much nitrogen, and this much potassium. So if you put these levels, there is the bulk density calculation in here. If you put those levels into this equation that I have from the soil test, you would need to add 3.37 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And you would, the p value, which I think there's an error with that because it seems really high for that soil, but that is negative. So you don't need to add any phosphorus. And then the, for for potassium, you would put that into the equation, you get that you need to add 4.5 pounds of potassium per 1,000 square feet. So to calculate the fertilizer need, the fertilizer you buy is not pure nutrient. The potassium is given on a K2O or potash basis, and your phosphorus is given on a P2O5 basis, and nitrogen is just the percent that it is nitrogen. So like urea, which is commonly used agriculture fertilizer, is 45% nitrogen, and potash, which is commonly used potassium fertilizer, is 60% nitrogen, 60% potassium. And so if you buy 10%, 10 fertilizer like you commonly add to your garden, you take the amount pounds you need to add and divide it by 0.1 because that is the percentage of nitrogen it is, and that would give you how much you need to apply. So like in this, using this and calculating what you need to apply for your urea, you would take the 3.37 pounds needed and divide it by 0.45 pounds N per pound urea fertilizer. And you would need to get that you need to add 7.5 pounds of urea. So if you had 10 fertilizer, you would take this 3.37 pounds it needed per 1,000 square feet and divide by 0.1 pounds N per pound urea fertilizer. And then you need to add 30, what that would be 33 pounds of that per 1,000 square feet, which is quite a bit. But for example, if you added that straight 10 fertilizer to the nitrogen requirement, you would be adding a lot of phosphorus to it, and this soil already has high phosphorus. And same thing with the potassium that we have. So you take that, divide by the percent potash, percent K2O that's in potash fertilizer, and you need to add 7.5 pounds of that. But I understand in a garden it's probably a lot easier just to get 10 fertilizer or manure or compost for getting these concentrated fertilizers that they're commonly used in row crops systems. So here's the percent N, P, and K of these different fertilizers. These are probably more commonly used in agronomy settings and garden settings, but if you were doing larger scale, these are what percentage they would be. And here's the NP and K of some different organic fertilizers that I have. And the values of these organic fertilizers can vary a lot depending upon the source they come from. And especially compost here can really vary depending upon what's being added to a compost. If you're just making compost with your own food waste and adding it to your garden just to the way of recycling material, I would not worry that much about it. But if you look at the ratio that plants remove these nutrients versus the ratio that they are in the compost, your N to P ratio in the compost is much lower than the N to P ratio in that the plant removes. So you're removing a lot more nitrogen versus phosphorus in the plant. So you'll eventually build up phosphorus in your soil. But phosphorus and potassium really won't go anywhere if they're in your soil. So I would just soil test your garden occasionally just to see what's in it for concentrations. And here's an estimation of fertilizer equivalents for on manures, and this is from some grad students project in Minnesota, and this is just the average of the different manures types. And you can see the percent solids of these manures vary a lot. Some are high in liquids and some are higher in solids. And obviously if you compost the manure, it'll be a lot higher in solids. But you can see that the amount of these different elements vary a lot depending upon the type of manure. And the good thing about adding manures or compost is they're essentially broken down plant material, so they also contain elements such as sulfur and other micro and macronutrients. So you're adding them back to the soil and in addition to the N, P, and K in them. So it'll help keep your nutrient levels of other nutrients higher versus time than if you're just adding N, P, and K fertilizer, if you're adding organic fertilizer such as compost or manures. And here's the soil pH where plant nutrients are the most available. Ideally, you want your soil between 6 and 7. If you look at this chart, that's when most of the nutrients, if you're looking across them, are most available to plants. And here's the ideal pH for range for some vegetable crops. And here is my contact information. And there's our extension thing that we're supposed to put on our slides. Any questions, or do you just want to wait till after Laura's done?
I do see one question, and if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. But Michael put in the chat, my soil sample called for a 10-0-0 fertilizer. I know you can't recommend a particular vendor, but I hope you can help nonetheless. Would you have any recommendations or
So
ideas for
so
him?
essentially they're asking for a fertilizer. Their soil test must have adequate phosphorus and potassium and they need nitrogen. So they just asked for a fertilizer that has nitrogen in it and doesn't have phosphorus and potassium. And so I would just get a fertilizer that's mostly nitrogen and doesn't have phosphorus and potassium in it. I'm not sure what they sell them. I'm sure some of the lawn fertilizer, I guess a lot of the lawn fertilizer probably has potassium in it too, but they do sell some lawn fertilizers that have more nitrogen, mostly nitrogen in them.
Okay.
Or you could get your urea and apply it at a really low rate if it called for 10-0-0. Obviously, the urea is a lot richer than a 10 higher in N than a 10-0-0. But when people need to put people in like if you're planting potatoes commercially, you're probably putting down 200, 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So you're putting down a lot of product. Whereas in the garden, you obviously you don't need to apply that much product.
Mm-hmm. All right, there is another question. Sandy has a question about using sheep's wool pellets to increase nitrogen. Just found out about it, and what do you think?
I I think they may increase nitrogen. Are these stored on? I think they may increase nitrogen. I don't have the exact nitrogen rate amount of nitrogen in them. Like I know, like feather meal also, like feather meal is a similar thing to what the sheep pellets were, so I'm sure they would add nitrogen. I just don't know the exact amount. I suppose you would want to incorporate them into the soil versus broadcast them on the surface, because I assume if they're on the surface, they probably won't become plant available very quickly.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So I know Christine Lang and Jalen Wiley. She's a sheep specialist. Christine's a horticulture consumer horticulturist. So they are kind of looking at the sheep wool pellets and hopefully be doing some tests on those um, to see if those would kind of help at all as
I
well.
think some of these for that I think to Jennifer Thom's question, I think some of the formulas are stored on the SDSU extension website in the soil fertilizer recommendations guide. Or also if you just needed help, you could email me and I could help you.
Question. Someone else asked, does putting leaves on over winter help turning the soil in the spring help with soil fertility?
Putting the leaves into the soil definitely adds nutrients to the soil. The one thing with applying things that have a lot of carbon and little bit of nitrogen like that to the soil is they might tie up. The plant microbes need a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio to survive, and they will like one about, I think it's like 24 to 1, whereas leaves will have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of like 40 to 50 to 1. If they're brown leaves, they'll have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than green leaves. But essentially, they may take some of the nitrogen free nitrogen that's in the plant available forms, which is ammonium and nitrate in the soil, and use it to decompose the leaves, but it'll still be stored in your soil as total nitrogen and it'll be released in the future. But there's also other plant nutrients in the leaves too. So I think if you add organic mulches to the soil, it really helps keep nutrients in your soil because you're adding nutrients, plant material back into the soil, which contains the nutrients that the plants take up. So I think like the reason my community garden was low on P and K is because people take out a lot of the plant material out of it and just remove it because they want you to do that. And that essentially takes nutrients out of the soil that would be returned back if you return the plant materials back into the soil.
Awesome. Would you say grass clippings would also help?
Yeah,
Grass clippings, okay.
but they have a lower C to N carbon and nitrogen ratio than leaves do.
Okay, so leaves would be
But
the best.
I would say anything with a lot of these organic fertilizers and the leaves, it's not like the nutrients are immediately available. Like the first year, you'll be able to get so much percent of them, and then the next year it'll go down the road. But I think if you have a good soil microbial communities, they'll be released throughout the season, and
Awesome.
plants can take it up.
All right, well, if anyone has any more questions for Hans, feel free to put them in the chat. But we are going to switch over to Laura Edwards. She is SDSU Extension State Climatologist and looking forward to this update.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sid. And good talk, Hans. I know I learned a little something there too. So, I like to share pictures of my garden when I'm visiting with you all here in Garden Hour, but you know, if I were to show you a picture, it'd just be a bunch of seed packets right now. I don't have anything in the ground just yet. But I did see a tinge of green in the lawn here on Sunday and just the last couple days. So hopefully spring is coming soon. But speaking of spring, just sharing a couple pictures here from our mesonet location at DeSmet. That is today. That was about 5:30 or so this afternoon, this evening. So yeah, that's kind of the picture of today. No April Fool's joke here, and I know a lot of areas in the Northeast got some snow. We've had some rain in a lot of places, so everywhere, but probably the northwest corner today And I know every drop counts this year as we're carrying over some dry soils from last year. So I'll talk about soil moisture in a little bit. I've got a lot of material to go through because it's spring. It's April 1st. There's a lot going on, you know, as we're getting ready for the season to really start in earnest. Let's just look at the last month or so and just see where we've been temperature-wise. March was warmer than average everywhere statewide. Probably the areas that were closest to average temperature are those areas in the far west and these kind of lighter orange areas down along in the south. Those are, you know, about near to maybe 2 to 4 degrees above average. There are some really dark spots up north where we're looking at, you know, 8 to 10 or more degrees above average for the month of March. So everywhere red here is 6 to 8 degrees above average. So really quite a warm month compared to typical. It was just like consistently warm. A couple days really were much above average, but it really was kind of steadily warm over most of the month. Precipitation, I'll show you two ways to look at precipitation for March. The first here, this is just looking at total rainfall for the month. You can see all across pretty much across the northern tier and areas of and parts of the plains of the west, quite below average, you know, very little rainfall, if any at all. Moisture-wise for the month, we had I've seen a handful of stations that reported no measurable rainfall in March. So that is a tough way to start the season. As you go further towards the southeast, however, you get into the darker colors. Average precipitation for the month of March is, oh gosh, 1 1/4 inches, something like that for most of us. So so yeah, down in that southeast corner, they were closer towards average, and we'll look at that on the next map. But you know, those blues, purples, you're looking at something close to 2 inches, more or less, in that southeast corner. So here's a look compared to average. So this is the percent of average. So the warm colors, the red, oranges, yellows, are below average, and that's a scale at the bottom. The greens, blues, purples are above average. So you see a few bullseye dots there across the state and the wetter and drier areas compared to average. But really, again, sticking out the dry conditions in the north and kind of central, west central part of the state. And there's very few areas that were above normal in the greens, blues, purples. Really kind of that south to southeast quarter of the state there. So, and a lot of that just really happened just right at the last weekend of the month. Just looking at Friday, Saturday, and that last event just kind of bumped a lot of people up above average. It was kind of running kind of near average up until that point. So let's look at soil moisture. We have pretty much all the soils are thawed in the profile, except for just a few kind of stubborn stations in the northeastern corner, and you can see those with the gray discs there. So this is our poker chip map looking at all the depths of the soil sensors at the Mesonet weather station locations. I have the scale at the bottom, but generally looking at blues are wetter, greens are in the middle, and oranges and yellows are drier. And so you can see kind of each layer of the soil and the profile, you know, kind of relatively speaking, if, you know, who's wetter, who's drier. It's not unusual right in this thaw season, right when the soil first thaws, you see a bump really quick right away with soil moisture going up. A lot of the stations in the south and all West River, pretty much Central and West River, have been thawed now for something close to 2 weeks, maybe longer. So the soil moisture at those stations, I think, has kind of settled a little bit. I did grab this. This is as of yesterday, so this doesn't reflect any precipitation today. Okay. But you can see those stations in the northeast where you have a couple that are that darker blue. Again, they get that little bump right when they thaw out, but that will kind of settle down, I think. But again, looking at a lot of these data, a lot of yellow there in the north central to northwestern corner of the state. You know, kind of at different depths, you know, some shallower, some deeper, but down along the southeast, you see more of the blues. Again, I think that's picking up the precipitation that they had in March. Again, that's reflecting in the soils that they had something near to above average for moisture, and that's good news for soil moisture down there. For the northwest is kind of struggling. And you can look at the Mesonet data to dig into the specifics for each station. If you want to see each sensor and how they're going, you can see that too when you get into the actual stations if you want to. Looking at the drought monitors, it kind of gives us a snapshot of where we are drought-wise, and that's kind of the thread of the message I want to share with you today. Is we're really carrying over some very dry conditions from last year and from the winter, where we had what I would describe as a snow drought. You know, probably doesn't affect a lot of us in gardens or agriculture, but we do kind of miss that snowmelt season when we don't have that snowpack carrying water for us in the winter season. So we kind of lose that kind of bump in soil moisture, the extra moisture here in the spring season. So that's kind of bad news. So right now we have 100% of the state in some level of drought, and on here on the drought monitor, that's defined as D1 or moderate drought. That's the beige color, or darker. So the beige, orange, and red are all different levels of drought here. This is a map that's produced every week, and they have a rotation of authors that are multiple agencies like USDA and NOAA or NOAA, National Drought Mitigation Center, and so on. And so no single person has a very strong influence on this, as they do that on rotation. But we do have, I and others here in South Dakota have the opportunity to share what's going on here locally and what's our local data showing and that kind of thing. So if you happen to see this and you're like, oh gosh, that drought monitor, it's really off one way or the other, too wet, too dry, whatever, feel free to share a note with me, send me an email. If you have rainfall data from your yard or garden, pictures to share about impacts and so on, I'd love to see those too. But yeah, here we are, just starting the season in drought really right now. Last year this time, over half the state was in dry conditions, but only 8% of the state a year ago was in some level of drought of that D1 or worse. So we did have some dry conditions last year, but nothing like we have right now. So kind of changing focus here a little bit, looking now at soil temperature and not soil moisture. I'm going to show two maps of soil temperature, and this is the first, it's 4-inch depth under bare soil. So there's no grass, nothing growing on this. 4-inch depth under bare soil. So this is more like what you might see in your garden, potentially, certainly like an agriculture, like a crop field, something like that. That's kind of what this is reflecting. So as of today, this was this was yesterday, I think. You know, a lot of them hovering right around 40 degrees, you know, upper 30s to lower 40s, something like that. Again, this is under bare soil. So these run maybe a little bit warmer than what you'll see in your lawn, in your yard, anything that's vegetated out in a field or pasture, for example. And so looking at what we see under sod or natural cover, pretty similar, a little bit cooler. You can pick your favorite weather station, your favorite location, hopefully something near you. And check that out there. So I know, you know, it's time that people are getting ready to plant their small grains in the agricultural setting. Maybe you're getting ready to plant some early season stuff. So we're getting really close at 40 degrees in most areas. It's kind of a magic number for some folks. I know other people have told me that they use these soil temperature maps or these data to help them clue in on when to start looking for wild asparagus, and maybe some other of those kind of forage foods. So that's something that you can also think about if that's something that you like to do too. So let's look out ahead, look at what's happening in the coming week, 2 weeks, and months. And so we're getting into the outlook part, starting with the next 6 to 10 days. So this was published this afternoon, so this is pretty recent here. These maps are published every day, including over the weekend. I'll say on Saturday and Sundays, it's auto-generated, so there's not actually a person that actually goes through the map, but during the week they do have forecasters that look at this and fine-tune it a little bit. So here, 6 to 10 days out, that's April 7th to 11th, so about a week and a half from now. First, looking on the left side, temperature does look to be leaning above average for all of pretty much all of South Dakota at that point. We're really squeezed between an area that's going to be very warm, high pressure dominated in the west to very cool and wetter conditions over the east. And then that brings me to the next map on the right, which is the precipitation outlook for 6 to 10 days out. As starting yesterday, well, even Sunday, a little bit on the automatic generated map, started to hint at this dry pattern setting up here around the middle of April. So after we see the system pass through today, tomorrow, and maybe depending where you are, maybe a little longer, does look like it's going to turn dry next week. So maybe not great news for all of us who could use a little moisture, but maybe there'll be a chance there if you're in the agriculture setting too to get out and get some field work done too. This is the total rainfall forecast for the next 7 days. So within that same kind of window of time, you'll see northeastern South Dakota show up a little bluer there. That's really reflecting the next day or so through the rest of today and tomorrow, where we're seeing this system still in play right now. Even the blue areas, though, you're looking at 1/2 inch to 1.25 inches, something around an inch. As we get into March, our average precipitation in March starts really ramping up, like up around 3 inches or so for a lot of us, or 2 inches and change. So, so to get an inch in right away at the beginning of, April, getting an inch right away here at the beginning of April is good, but we have a little ways to go yet, even just to get to average for the month of April. One note here, if you have any friends in the Ohio River, Tennessee Valley, oh my gosh, they are really seriously preparing for something on the order of 10 or more inches of rain in the coming week, but really it's the next few days, I think. Really looking at some very high potential rainfalls there, some possible severe weather, I know tonight as well. So if you have friends down in that orange to really brown area, they are going to have a lot of water issues. That's really, really extreme. 8 to 14 days out. Now looking at 1 to 2 weeks out, we see that warmer area over the west really start to migrate eastward and really kind of cover South Dakota. So I have a little more confidence there that warmer temperatures than average anyway are more likely there that middle of the month. So this is April 9th to 15th, okay? When we get to the precipitation side again, Odds leaning slightly towards drier conditions, not as high confidence as the 6 to 10 day period had, but still odds leaning a little bit towards drier. We're kind of on that northern end, northern side of things that are looking drier. So yeah, it doesn't look super optimistic for much more precipitation there through the middle of the month. And then I just wanted to share this too, just so you know how much April contributes to the annual precipitation. And these are kind of two ways to look at it. On the left is the whole period of record, or almost whole period of record, 1895 through 2022. If you look at the whole long period of record, April contributes something around 10% in this light green area of the annual total. So we're starting to get into that wet season, right? If you just look at the more recent 15-year period, so 2008 to 22 on the right, similarly in those green areas, April contributes about 10%. Up in the north central region, a little less, more like 5 to 7% of the annual total for precipitation. But April and then May is when things really ramp up. I know we're not that close. We're just starting April, but I wanted to show May too. Why April, May, June are so important. About 40% of our annual precipitation comes in those 3 months, especially if you're out west. And so yeah, May precipitation is just as important, where you're bumping up into about the 15% range or more of the annual total coming just from the month of May. So the next couple months are really important. So as we look at April overall, I showed you the first couple weeks what they look like. When we're looking at the month overall, this was just released yesterday afternoon. Both on temperature and precipitation, the end of the month is really kind of unknown. There's a lot of conflicting signals, and models aren't really narrowing in on anything. So we have equal chances on the left, equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average temperature for the month overall. We're starting cool this first week, but then looking warm, and then kind of a big question mark after that. On the precipitation side for April, equal chances of wetter, drier, or near average. You see clearly they picked up that real significant event here in the first week of the month down in that Ohio, Tennessee River Valley. But up here in South Dakota, not really seeing anything clear one way or another. Again, when we look out 3 or 4 weeks, there's a lot more uncertainty in both the temperature and precipitation outlook for the north central states. Just want to toss this in because it's that spring season. I have a whole lot more maps here that Brett Lang helped me put together a few years ago. The URL is at the bottom, but I just wanted to show what is kind of a typical last spring frost for 32 degrees. And still, typically, they're still a month away. In that dark blue or dark purple, in the southeastern corner, that's really end of April 27th to May 3rd. But as you look in the lighter purples through the central part of the state, May 7th through 9th, further west even, you're looking at mid to late May. So we're still a ways off from our typical, let's say, last 32 degree temperature. But long-term trends show kind of earlier frost, but it really varies a lot from year to year. It's not really consistent year to year. All right, and then looking out further ahead, looking at April through June, all those 3 months put together, the temperature on the left very similar to a lot of the last map I showed you for April. We're warm across the south and the east, but the north central states really not consistent on the temperature outlook, either warmer or cooler. It's just a lot of mixed signals there on the temperature side for the spring season and the early summer. On the precipitation side, however, starting to hint at increased chances for drier, especially in the southwest corner. If you recall way back, that's a part of the state that's really suffered from the driest or the worst drought conditions more recently, I'd say over the last 6 to 9 months. So that's an area of concern as we get into the later spring here, okay? And then this is where I really want to send the message home that now is a time to prepare for potential dry conditions this summer. So before you plant your garden, you know, if you're looking at irrigation, setting up your water lines, be very, I'd say be very conscientious of that. Maybe you have the opportunity to change out a few things in your fruit or veggie garden or your flower garden that maybe isn't so water intensive for this year anyway. Looking at potentially, you know, drier and warmer conditions as we get into our stride in midsummer. So this is July through September. I can't emphasize enough that you have this great opportunity now to start planning for potential dry conditions. If things turn around in mid-season, wow, that'd be great. But this signal of this dryness in the summer has been very consistent over the last several months, I want to say 5 months or so, in the outlooks, hinting at this warmer summer. I'm not going to show this other data with you, but I looked at summers following La Nina winters. And in South Dakota and North Dakota, summers following La Nina winters are more commonly warm and dry. We've had a lot of drought following La Nina winters. Not all the time, but more often than not. So something to think about there as we get into that summer season. Hopefully they'll keep back the weeds a little bit and some of those other things with the dry conditions, but you may need to be watering more and doing those kinds of things. So think about that. And I know Dr. Lang and I have talked about putting out some information on better planning for drought in your horticulture and garden operations. So we'll be thinking about what we can put out for that. So that is all the news I have for today. Happy to take questions. I know it's not the greatest news, but I know a lot of you with gardens have a little more opportunity to still grow a great garden, even if we have dry and warm conditions. We're on the agriculture side, they're a little more complicated. It's not as easy. So thank you for your time, and I hope you guys have a great season. I'll be back, I think, in a couple months on Garden Hour, but I'll take questions for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. I do see one question. This one might kind of be for Hans. I will convert my backyard over to buffalo grass later this spring. Should I fertilize late summer / early fall, assuming young growth of the new planting? So what would you recommend, Hans, as far as timing and fertilizing? We can't. You're on mute.
I guess I would get their soil tested to see what's actually there. I suppose the soil might need a little nitrogen. I'm not the biggest fan of fertilizing lawns, but I also, if my lawn would not look all nice and pretty if I had a lawn. But I would just soil test and see how much level of nutrients you'd have. I assume most of the nutrients you'd probably have decent levels of in your yard, unless it was a newly excavated yard that was really highly disturbed. Because if you remove all the topsoil, a lot of the nutrients are stored up near the soil surface, so you probably might need nutrients if you were in a new development or did a lot of excavating. So I'll just get your soil tested.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I have a short little presentation. And if any of you think of any questions for Hans or Laura in between, you can feel free to add those to the chat. All right, everyone. think it's loading. All right, so my name is Sydney Trio. I'm the Education Coordinator and SDSU Extension Horticulture Assistant. Just a little update about the greenhouse. It is week 14 for us, and we just planted some different herbs like some basils, oregano. Just off the top of my head, we had some salvia, status, flowering tobacco, and phlox, but many more plants we started from seed. And then we also just transplanted geraniums into these larger pots. So it's about that time in the season. And a few of you might have seen our mapping system that we had before. It was pretty good, but there's kind of limited on what you could do. So this is what it looked like before. And now this is what it's going to look like. We're kind of still working on a few different accessibility points on here, but it should be available kind of April, May-ish. So if you ever visit the gardens here in Brookings, this will be an awesome tool to kind of help you see what plants are where. And if you're looking for a specific one and some more information. Also, a few of you might have seen this on our Facebook page today. We are getting a new glow-in-the-dark tree. So we're super excited. April Fools. So this is just a joke, April Fool's joke. There is no glow-in-the-dark tree. So upcoming though, we do have a garden activity book coming out that Robin Butterbaugh and I are kind of putting together. And we hope to release it at Garden Discovery Festival coming up on May 18th. So that is super exciting. Also upcoming next, we have our cut flower workshop at McCrory Gardens. And if you want to take your phone and look at some more information or register for this, there's the QR code. We do only have about 10 spots left, so it is filling up fast. So that is about 2 weeks away. And then we have an extravaganza, family weekend, and then a next big festival coming up is May 18th. We'll have our Garden Discovery Festival. We'll have Native Plant Initiative plant sale and Master Gardener plant sale, as well as some different presentations and tours throughout the day, and tons of awesome exhibitors with a bunch of information and hands-on activities. So there's just a little, some events coming up. And then lastly here, if you have any questions, here is a little guide of where you can send your questions to. Either calling on the hotlines or emailing works. And I would just like to remind folks that the regular season garden hour starts about a month away in May 6th. And yeah, about all I have.
Yes, and
I
I would
have
add the. Oh,
I
sorry.
have a question about the glow in the dark tree. Has McCrory Gardens tried planting the glow in the dark petunias at all?
Yes, okay, that actually isn't a joke. We did try growing the glow-in-the-dark petunias this last summer, and they did glow in the dark. It wasn't, the flower itself didn't really glow. It was a white petunia, but the foliage did. But it wasn't as super prominent.
Yeah, instead I was going to add about the garden hotlines that they are staffed now. I know
Yes.
at least here in Aberdeen, he started last week. So yeah, so people are there to help answer questions.
Yes. Teresa loves the glow-in-the-dark tree. We do have garden glow, but the trees don't actually glow during the summer. All right, would Hans and Laura like to share maybe one piece of advice or parting words for folks who are getting ready to start their gardens and start planting? We'll go with Laura first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, my key message is be ready for drought, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice the high end of production. Maybe that will even help you. Yeah, have a great plan in order in case things stay dry on you, and yeah, and I hope rain comes timely when you need it.
I guess I would say if you didn't soil sample in the fall, you could still soil sample in the spring. I just would not walk in your garden when it's really wet because you'll might have compaction issues or destroy things. But I would sample before you put your fertilizer down and not afterwards. And if you have questions interpreting soil tests, feel free to email them to me or call the Watertown Regional Center.
Awesome. I did see one question pop up. Is now a good time to set up rain barrels? I would say yes. As Laura kind of talked about, the precipitation kind of looks a little bit lower, but you can always set them up just in case.
Yeah, and I think we're beyond the time where we're going to have any solid freeze. So yeah, I think now would be a good time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you too for sharing your timely and helpful information.